Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep on this idea of narrow mental content. It's a really fascinating philosophical puzzle all about where the meaning of our thoughts comes from.
Yeah, it really gets at the heart of how our minds connect with, well, reality, right? Like, do we shape our thoughts or does the world kind of do it for us?
That's a great way to put it. I mean, it makes you question all sorts of things, about free will and the nature of reality and all that. But maybe we should start with the basics. What do we even mean when we talk about a thought having content?
Okay, so think about a simple belief, like your belief that pizza is delicious,
Yeah.
right? The content of that belief is, in essence, what it says about the world. It's that idea that pizza has this property, this deliciousness. It's the meaning, the representation that's packed into the thought itself.
So it's not so much about the actual neurons firing in my brain, but about what those neurons are, I guess, pointing to, what they're representing.
Yeah. Exactly. And now the question becomes, well, where does that meaning come from? Is it something purely internal, determined by how my brain happens to be wired? Or does it actually depend on my experiences out in the world, like on actually encountering pizza and having those taste sensations?
And that's where narrow content comes in, right? This idea that maybe there's some core of meaning that's independent of our environment, independent of our experiences.
You got it. Philosophers who are into this idea of narrow content, they believe there's a kind of mental essence to our
Yeah.
thoughts, something that would stay the same even if we lived in a totally different world.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. But how do we even, test that idea? It's not like we can just hop into a parallel universe and see if our thoughts change.
Well, that's where these things called thought experiments come in handy, and one of the most famous ones is Hillary Putnam's twin Earth scenario. It's really clever. Imagine two planets, Earth and twin Earth, right? They're identical, except for one teeny tiny difference.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the difference?
On Earth, the stuff we call water, well, it's H2O, standard stuff. But on twin Earth, the stuff that looks and acts exactly like water, it's actually a different substance. Let's call it XYZ.
So to someone living on Twin Earth, XYZ just is water. They'd drink it, they'd swim in it, never suspect a thing.
Exactly. Now imagine two people, Oscar on Earth and, well, let's call him twin Oscar on twin Earth. They're identical twins, but they've lived their whole lives on their respective planets. Never met, never even, heard of the other.
Right, right. Two identical guys, two very different kinds of water.
And here's Putnam's big question. Do Oscar and twin Oscar have the same thoughts about water, even though they've never actually experienced the same substance?
Whoa, that's a good one. It's like, on the one hand, they're identical twins, right? So you'd think their thoughts would be the same. But then their experience of what they're calling water is totally different.
And that's exactly the challenge to narrow content. Putnam argues that even though Oscar and twin Oscar are internally identical, their thoughts about water are actually different, and it all comes down to their different environments. He thinks most mental content is broad, meaning it depends on the external world, on what we encounter out there.
So even if I've never seen the actual chemical structure of H2O, like under a microscope or whatever, my thought about water is still fundamentally about H2O because that's the stuff I've been interacting with my whole life.
Precisely. Putnam's point is that when we think about these natural kinds, these categories like water, we're not just referring to their superficial appearances, right? We're aiming at something deeper. We're aiming to refer to their underlying nature, their essence, even if we can't, directly observe it.
That's deep. But what about cases where it's not so much about physical substances, but more about, I don't know, like social influences? Could those shape our thoughts too?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, the philosopher Tyler Burge, he's made very similar arguments, but focusing on social environments. His famous example involves the concept of arthritis. Imagine someone who, well, they just have this misconception about arthritis. They think it can affect any part of the body, not just the joints.
So they might say, oh man, I think I've got arthritis in my thigh.
Right, exactly. Now, imagine we transport this person to a world where everyone, including all the medical experts, everyone uses arthritis in the correct way, only for joints. In this new world, our confused friend would still be wrong about what arthritis is, even though their whole social environment has changed.
Wow, so it's not just the physical stuff we encounter, but also the concepts and definitions we, I guess, inherit from our communities.
Exactly. Our thoughts are so deeply intertwined with these social and linguistic environments, not just with the physical world.
Okay, so the twin earth and arthritis examples, they're pretty strong arguments for this broad content idea. But doesn't that leave narrow content, kinda, out in the cold? If most of our thoughts are shaped by the outside world, what room is left for anything purely internal?
That's the big question, and that's what makes this whole debate so interesting. Despite these great arguments for broad content, some philosophers still think there must be some part of our thoughts that's determined just by our internal makeup, by who we are on the inside.
So how do they defend this idea of narrow content? What are their arguments?
Well, there are a few really intriguing lines of reasoning, and they go from like the way our thoughts cause our actions to the very nature of, well, conscious experience itself.
All right, I'm definitely ready to hear more. Let's dive into those arguments.
So one of the most compelling arguments for narrow content actually comes from thinking about the causes of our behavior. If our thoughts are really what's driving our actions, then shouldn't there be something intrinsic to those thoughts that gives them their causal power? Something independent of the environment, you know what I mean?
I think I see what you mean. Like, if the meaning of my thought, I'm thirsty, totally depended on my surroundings, then how could it reliably make me reach for a glass of water, no matter if I'm in my kitchen or like stranded in a desert?
Precisely. For a thought to consistently cause the same action, across all these different environments, it seems like there needs to be some kind of core meaning there, some narrow content that stays stable no matter what's going on outside.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Are there other arguments for narrow content besides this causal one?
Oh yeah, there are a few. Another really interesting one comes from introspection. We seem to have this kind of privileged, direct access to our own thoughts, right? Like, I can know what I mean when I think the sky is blue without needing to check any external sources or anything.
Yeah, totally. It feels like I've got this immediate grasp of my own thoughts, like they're these self-contained units of meaning that don't need constant validation from the outside world.
Exactly. But if the content of my thought was totally dependent on the world around me, on my social environment, my language, all that stuff, how is it that I can just know what I'm thinking without needing to constantly check in with all those external factors?
That is a really good point. If the meaning of my thoughts was constantly shifting based on, whatever's going on outside of me, it seems like introspection would be so much more confusing.
Exactly. So this argument from introspection, it suggests there must be some aspect of mental content that's just directly accessible to us, something that's not, constantly being reshaped by all these external forces.
Okay, so the causal argument and the introspection argument, they're both pointing towards this need for some kind of narrow content. Are there any other arguments we should consider?
You bet. There's actually a whole line of reasoning based on rationality. Saul Kripke, he's this super influential philosopher of language. He has this really compelling example. Imagine a guy named Pierre. He learns about the city called London from, let's say, his French textbooks, right? So he forms all these beliefs about this city, like London is pretty and London is in England, the usual stuff.
Okay, so he's got this whole set of beliefs about London, but he's only learned about it indirectly.
Right. Now imagine Pierre moves to London, but he doesn't realize it. He sees this city, but he doesn't think it's very nice, and he learns that its name is Londres. So he starts forming beliefs like Londres is ugly and Londres is in England, but, unbeknownst to him, London and Londres, they actually refer to the same city.
Oh, poor Pierre. He's got these totally contradictory beliefs about the same place.
Exactly. But here's the kicker. Kripke says that Pierre could still be perfectly rational, even though he's got these contradictory beliefs.
How is that possible?
Well, it's because, from Pierre's point of view, he's got two totally distinct thoughts. One about London and one about Londres.
Oh, I see. So even though his beliefs clash from like an outside perspective,
Right.
internally they make sense to him because he thinks they're about different things.
Exactly. And this suggests that there's this level of mental content that's determined by Pierre's internal cognitive structure, not by the external reality of whether London and Londres actually refer to the same place. And that's a big win for the idea of narrow content. It's like there's this internal meaning that's fixed by how our minds are structured, not by, all the messy complexities of the outside world.
That's such a clever example. I never thought about it that way before. Okay, so we've got the causal argument, the introspection argument, and now the rationality argument, all suggesting that maybe some of our mental content is narrow. Are there any other arguments for narrow content we should cover?
There's one more, and it's a bit more, I don't know, subtle. It comes from the idea of what's called phenomenal intentionality.
Phenomenal intentionality. I'm not sure I'm familiar with that.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful. It's basically this notion that the way an experience feels, like the subjective quality of it, can itself determine some aspect of the content of that experience.
Okay, can you unpack that a little? I'm not sure I'm following.
Sure, sure. Think about the difference between, say, seeing the color red and hearing a high-pitched tone. The qualities of those two experiences, the way they feel to you, they're totally different, right? And those differences in feeling, in what we call phenomenal character, they seem to contribute to the fact that one experience is about color and the other is about sound.
So you're saying that, like, the very nature of the experience, the way it feels, is already telling you something about what that experience is about.
Exactly. And this phenomenal intentionality, this kind of intrinsic link between the feeling of an experience and its content, well, some philosophers think it's a strong indicator of narrow content.
It's like the way an experience feels is already pointing you towards a certain meaning, even before you try to put it into words or categorize it or anything like that.
Precisely. And that intrinsic meaning, that content that seems to arise directly from the way an experience feels, well, that's likely independent of your specific environment. It's a kind of meaning that you carry within you, regardless of what's happening in the world around you.
Okay, so we've got these four main arguments for narrow content.
Yeah.
The causal argument, the introspection argument, the rationality argument, and the phenomenal intentionality argument. And it seems like there's a pretty strong case to be made that some aspects of our thoughts are determined internally, regardless of our environment. But I got to admit, I'm still kind of struggling to picture what this narrow content actually is. Like, what does it look like? How do we even identify it?
That's a great question. And honestly, it's a question philosophers have been wrestling with for decades. There are all these different attempts to try to conceptualize narrow content, each with its own, strengths and weaknesses. Do you want to delve into some of those conceptions?
Absolutely. I'm super curious to see how philosophers have tried to pin down this elusive thing we call narrow content. So we've got these like compelling arguments for why narrow content should exist, but actually figuring out what it is seems like a whole other problem. Where do we even start looking for this like internal meaning?
Well, one way to think about it is imagine trying to strip away all the external references. Kind of peeling back the layers of the onion to get to that core concept. This is the idea of what's called descriptive content.
So instead of my thought about, let's say, water being tied to my experiences with actual H2O here on Earth, we try to define water in a way that doesn't depend on any particular substance.
Exactly. Maybe the narrow content of water is something like a clear, colorless, odorless liquid. It's a description that captures the, essential features of water without relying on any specific thing out there in the world.
It's like creating a blueprint for water that could apply to, all sorts of different substances in different possible world, as long as they fit that description.
Precisely. But, and there's always a but, right? Even these seemingly internal descriptions, they might actually rely on concepts that themselves have broad content. Like liquid, for example. That's a concept we learn through interacting with the world.
Ah, so it's like trying to define words using a dictionary that's written in a language you don't understand. We get stuck in this loop.
Yeah, that's one of the big challenges with this descriptive content approach. It's really hard to be sure that we've truly gotten rid of all those external influences.
Okay, so maybe descriptive content isn't the answer. What are some other ways philosophers have tried to, I guess, capture this idea of narrow content?
Another approach, it focuses on the role a concept plays in our thinking, rather than what it refers to out there in the world. This is called the conceptual role, conception of narrow content.
So instead of asking, like, what is water, we'd ask, how does the concept of water function in my reasoning, in my inferences?
Exactly. Think about a simple concept like and. We don't really understand "and" by pointing to some object out there in the world, right? We understand it by how it connects other concepts. Pizza and soda, happy and excited. The narrow content of "and" would be its role in our, our logical thinking.
So narrow content becomes less about a concept's connection to the external world and more about the relationships between concepts, like the internal logic of our thoughts.
Precisely. However, this approach runs into its own issues. It can lead to a view of our thoughts that's, a bit too interconnected. Like, if I change one belief, it could have this ripple effect, changing the meaning of all my other beliefs, you see.
That does seem a bit rigid. It's like saying if I change my mind about pineapple on pizza, suddenly my whole understanding of logic and language goes out the window.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't quite capture the flexibility, the dynamism of how we actually think. And there's another worry. This approach seems to focus more on like the mechanics of thought than on meaning itself.
Like we're studying the grammar of a sentence but not really understanding the meaning it conveys.
Exactly. We're left wondering if conceptual role, while important, can really fully capture, all the richness of mental content.
Okay, so we've got descriptive content and conceptual role, and both of them have some issues. Are there any other contenders in this battle to define narrow content?
There's one more worth mentioning. It's called the mapping conception. This one suggests that narrow content is kind of like a map that helps us translate our internal mental states into broad content in different contexts.
So it's like having a mental decoder ring that helps us apply our internal understanding to whatever specific world we happen to be in.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Imagine my internal concept of water, right? And let's say that concept is a map. When I encounter H2O here on Earth, that map guides me to understand that, okay, this substance, this is what water refers to in this context.
And if I were on Twin Earth, encountering XYZ, my map would guide me to understand that water refers to that substance in that context.
Exactly. But, and this is a big but, if narrow content is supposed to be independent of the external world, how can we even express it using language, which itself seems to have, well, broad content?
It's like trying to draw a map of an unknown territory using landmarks that are constantly shifting and changing. It's a real head-scratcher.
It is, and some philosophers actually think this suggests that narrow content, despite its importance in our thinking, might be ultimately ineffable, something we just can't fully articulate.
Well, this has been quite a journey. We started out asking this seemingly simple question: where does the meaning of our thoughts come from? And we've ended up in this fascinating philosophical labyrinth, exploring these deep ideas about how our minds connect with reality. We've looked at arguments for both broad content, this idea that meaning is shaped by the world around us, and narrow content, this tantalizing notion of a kind of mental essence that's independent of our environment. We've even explored different ways philosophers have tried to pin down what this narrow content might actually be.
And it's a debate that's still going strong. Philosophers are still actively working on this problem, trying to clarify these concepts and really get to the bottom of what makes our thoughts tick.
It's amazing to think that something as basic as, like, thinking about a glass of water can lead to these huge philosophical questions. It really makes you appreciate the incredible complexity of the human mind. And, even if we don't have all the answers yet, just grappling with these ideas, it can change the way we see the world, the way we understand ourselves. It's like suddenly the world becomes this much more mysterious, much more interesting place.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that there's still so much we don't know, so much left to explore.
Well, on that note, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into narrow mental content. It's been a real pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
Likewise, always a great time.